Hey metas, Jonathan here at Night Knowledge, and take it from me, the Corrosion Power Surge shotgun build in Once Human is one of the best ones out there. If all you care about is the build, use the chapters below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more to-the-point guides on games that you love. As some background, I've spent all of my StarCrom for the past 2 seasons trying nearly every build to stay competitive with and beat the shrapnel build that my friend Minori uses. I've done a fire machine gun, the no reloading Frost Vortex SMG build, a Bastille Predator fast gunner build, and both unstable bomber builds. So much StarCrom, tungsten, and even more Stardust source. And it always comes back to the Corrosion Surge shotgun build, dealing the highest DPS. I'm not going to show you footage against a training dummy because I don't think it is a realistic indicator of true DPS because it relies on perfect conditions at point blank range that you won't be able to replicate in real situations. This build is both strong and fun because it's pretty simple to set up, deals a ton of damage both at close range and long distance, and finally is flexible, being effective against great ones or groups of weaker enemies. Starting off with the weapons, we have the ACS-12 Corrosion. It's a full auto 18 shell drum shotgun. This will be our primary weapon. We'll prefer to get real close to our target so the buckshot deals more damage, but you'll see that the main source of damage comes from the Power Surge, which has a 70% chance to trigger on any shot. What makes this different compared to other Surge weapons is that it doesn't cause an accuracy debuff on enemies, which doesn't seem like a big deal to me. And unlike other Power Surge weapons, the Corrosion Power Surge can crit, and the crit damage can stack when Power Surge is triggered. When it comes to weapon accessories, I'd focus on accuracy unless you find yourself having a hard time controlling the recoil. The weapon calibration I'd highly recommend is the Rapid Fire Weapon Blueprint calibration, which increases your rate of fire. Try to aim for double crit rate calibrations, but if you don't have many options, double crit damage or even double status damage can do in a pinch. Our secondary weapon is the Desert Eagle Wildfire. This gun's special ability applies bullseye, causing you to deal more damage to the target, and if there aren't any enemies nearby, you deal 25% more damage for 10 seconds, and hitting a weak spot increases your attack by 3% that can stack 3 times. So we're looking at a ceiling of 35% additional damage when using the Wildfire and the Corrosion together. I'd recommend the long axe melee weapon, which you'll need to manually switch to and do a heavy attack to trigger Fortress Warfare that increases your damage as well, which gives you a 20% weapon damage buff for 5 seconds. In a perfect situation, you'd apply bullseye with your Desert Eagle first, switch to your long axe, and just swing, do a heavy attack into the air to trigger Fortress Warfare, and finally switch to the Corrosion and don't stop shooting for maximum damage. Otherwise, you can just aim for center mass with the Corrosion when the enemy is far away in the hopes of triggering Power Surge, and then aiming for weak spots like the head when enemies are up close. Onto our armor, we'll start off with the most important piece of the build, which is the Mayfly goggles. These are epic goggles with a key effect that causes you to trigger 1 additional Power Surge damage effect whenever you trigger one, at the cost of 30% less damage. So for those that are bad at math, say your Power Surge hits for 10 damage normally. With the Mayfly goggles equipped, it'll do 30% less damage, so 7 damage, but twice for 14 damage total, essentially a 40% increase to your damage. The best thing is, Power Surge can trigger on enemies super far away, dealing maximum damage. There is an alternate legendary helmet that increases your crit rate chance, but I personally like this Mayfly goggles better and was able to upgrade the blueprint to max in just 2 seasons, and this means you'll also finish your build quicker. I then use a 4-in-1 combination of legendary armor pieces of Lone Wolf and Bastille. 4 pieces of Lone Wolf armor, which will give you increased magazine capacity, crit rate, and crit damage. I then use 1 piece of Bastille, which gives me 10% more damage when player health is above 70%. It's up to you though if you want to change this Bastille piece for something else. We'll talk about the ideal weapon and armor mods next, and what alternatives you can use. I've tested them all, and there is minimal change in DPS in my opinion, and if you're not sure, try to aim to use the one with the best attribute effects. Starting with the corrosion, I'm using Shock Rampage. When you deal Power Surge damage, you increase the chance to trigger it, which then snowballs. I personally think though that the Static Shock mod, which gives a flat 20% additional damage, is better, but as you can see, my attribute effects on Shock Rampage are really good, giving increased Power Surge damage, chance, and crit damage. For the Wildfire Desert Eagle, I use Vulnerability Amplifier, which increases damage to the target by an additional 8%. For the Long Axe, I use Final Territory, which increases weapon damage and movement speed by 10% for 10 seconds after Fortress Warfare ends. For the Helmet slot, I use Fateful Strike, which causes you to not deal weak spot damage, but increases your crit rate by 10% and crit damage by 30%. A weak alternative to Fateful Strike could be Deviation Expert, that decreases your range but increases your fire rate and status damage. Only take this if you don't have Fateful Strike or somehow get really great attribute effects. For the Mask slot, I recommend First Electrocution, that increases your Power Surge ultimate damage by 30%. The Corrosion doesn't cause status effects, and this is perfect. An alternative is Thunderclap, that causes an additional Power Surge after 20 Power Surges, but only get this if you don't have any First Electrocution mods. The chest piece is a boring slot for almost all builds, I think, so just pick the mod that gives you the best attribute effects, like element damage, status damage, magazine capacity, or even weapon damage. I picked Rejuvenating primarily for doing silos and keeping my health up. For the Pants mod slot, I selected Deadshot, which causes each crit to give a stacking crit damage buff up to 45%. For the gloves, there are many good options to choose from, but I'm using Crit Boost, which increases crit rate by 15%, and because it has some good attribute effects of increased weapon damage and crit damage. A better alternative if you have good attribute effects is the Crit Amplifier mod, which increases crit chance by 10% and crit damage by 15%. Finally, for the boot slot, I find it's situational, and it depends on whether you're doing silos or prime wars or don't want to switch that often. In most cases for convenience, I pick Ruthless Reaper, that refills my magazine after every 2 kills. But if you're looking to just pump out the most DPS for prime wars or boss battles, you might just be better off with Secluded Strike or Slow and Steady for increases to your damage. Let's talk about Cradle Overrides that provide buffs to your character. The most important one is the one that always affects you, which is Handgun Enhancement to raise shotgun damage by 20%. Status Enhancement gives 3 seconds of increased status damage after getting a weak spot hit, but note that some great ones don't have weak spots. Transient Impact is a long-term 15-second override that increases Power Surge and shock elemental damage when you defeat an enemy. This is a seasonal Cradle Override for Season 2, so you'll need to find something else for future seasons. The next 2 Cradle Overrides gives bonuses to damage for 4 seconds after reloads, First Round Blast, and Tactical Combo. The next 2 gives 25% damage when fighting Great Ones, Deviation Master and Master Tactician. These 2 require you to have your deviation out and use tactical items like grenades or drones. The last option I've selected is Advantage Barrier that gives a damage shield when you get weak spot hits or by reloading. This is also a seasonal Cradle Override. The last thing we'll discuss for the Power Surge shotgun build is the deviation you should use. This is a simple one, the Lone Wolf's Whisper, which is a deviation you can obtain from the Shadowhound Great One at the Monolith of Thirst in the southwest part of the map. This deviation increases your weapon damage by 20% or more depending on the level of the deviation and does a great job drawing aggro. So now you have everything you need to set up a Surge shotgun build in Once Human. As a recap, the biggest impact to the build is obviously the Corrosion shotgun itself and then the Mayfly goggles. Make sure that you're making max tier versions, calibrating the weapons, armor, and mods. I like to save loadouts so I can switch between different builds, and if you don't know how to create a loadout, check out my video on it. I hope this helped you out. Let me know in the comments below what you think makes this build better and why. Check out the rest of my channel for other videos on Once Human, video games, board games, and other fun things. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.